Hi, welcome back. We're now going to be moving into Unit 5, which covers Chapter 6, The Revolution. The first half of this series is going to be titled The Americans' Struggle. When we had met last time, I had left you a quote from the Declaration of Independence. I said, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." These men knew that they were laying their lives on the line for this revolution, for declaring independence. Basically, they knew that this was suicide by treason, that this could be it for them. But still, one by one, they came up and they signed the Declaration of Independence. So it's one thing to declare independence. Now there is going to have to be a war in order to have independence officially recognized from the British. So looking at our screen here, we are going to be covering the Revolution just to explain some of the pictures that I have going on here. Obviously we have the British flag and the American colonies flag. These two men are very important in this war. On the English side, this is going to be Lord Cornwallis, and on the American side, George Washington. And this picture in the middle here is at the surrendering at Yorktown, where we have Cornwallis surrendering to George Washington to end the war, which then will lead to the British finally recognizing American independence. Right, so before we get rolling, I want you to have your note packet out. The Revolution note packet looks like this. Get your name on it. And page 2 is the definitions, which you should have already done. And if you will be on page 3 with your pencil at hand, and then we can go ahead and get ready here. So, at the onset of the American Revolutionary War, there were some people who believed that this war could be won quickly. The British definitely thought that they could take out the Americans rather quickly, and they had a right to think so. John Adams told the Second Continental Congress, "We shall have a long and bloody war to go through." Basically, he's warning them, look, we better know what we're doing because it's going to get ugly. Many, even on the American side, did not believe that the Americans could win this, because on paper it looks like the British should be able to crush the Americans. So having said that, let's go ahead and look at some of the British advantages heading into the Revolutionary War. Well, number one, the British are going to have the #1 Navy. A century earlier, the Navy had defeated the Spanish Armada, which up until that point had been the most fierce Navy, most powerful Navy in the world. But ever since they took out the Spanish Armada, it's going to be the British who are going to rule the seas around the world, literally around the world. Experience. Since they have been fighting in Europe for decades upon decades with the French, with the Spanish, these soldiers, these redcoats, have had a lot of experience, and plus with their experience already in America with the French and Indian War. As a matter of fact, a British soldier is going to have 6 times as much experience than an American soldier, and even more so than say, the militia. Thirdly, the British Empire was very wealthy. They literally had colonies or empires all around the world, taking natural resources and with the idea of mercantilism, ruling the world through their power, which they gained from their wealth from the lands. And fourthly, Great Britain, as far as population goes, is a lot larger than the United States of America. Now, the United States of America, square mileage-wise, is bigger, but when you look at the people, you have the British at 8 million in population, and in the United States, you have 2.5 million, which is almost 4 times as much. So you definitely have a lot more manpower, too. So, having said that, and obviously you can see the British have a lot of things going for them, let's also take a look at what the Patriots or the Americans didn't have going for them. Number one, they had no Navy. So here they are going to take on the greatest Navy in the world with absolutely nothing to oppose it. Number two, as we already discussed, these Americans lacked experience. What soldiers did have experience from the French and Indian War was still minimal at best when you compare it to the Redcoats. They also had little war materials. As you can remember, when the British tried to take on Bunker Hill, and the Americans had 200 some cannons surrounding Boston. Those weren't theirs. They actually stole it from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. So what war goods they did have, they had to go and steal from the British. Fourthly, they had an undisciplined army. They had problems keeping people in the army. When people signed up, they would only sign up for a one-year enlistment. Now, George Washington, even at the beginning, said, well, that's not going to do. We need longer enlistments. This war is going to go longer than a year. And also, you would have these undisciplined soldiers who were already merchants and farmers. They would leave, just drop down their arms and leave and go back home to take care of the harvest or take care of their businesses when things started to get bad back home. So they were very unreliable. And lastly, America was divided. We talked about how they were divided between patriots and loyalists and then the moderates. We also talked about how Georgia was a royal colony and for the most part is going to be sympathetic to the British. And also the Carolinas, who were given to the friends of the king, were basically royal colonies too, and so they're going to remain loyal and have tight ties with the British. So if the British are going to have any success, it's probably going to come in the form of being in the South here. Another interesting story about America being divided, not only were they divided by patriots versus loyalists, but it also put family members against each other. And one of the interesting stories is the story of Ben Franklin and his son, William Franklin. Franklin was one of the leading patriots of the time. And then his son, William Franklin, was a royal governor for the king in New Jersey. Before the onset of the war, the two met and talked and see if they could maybe come to terms with each other. And they could not. They would not. And basically when they left from their meeting, they knew that they may never ever see each other again, being that they were fighting on opposite sides. Also, you had certain groups in America that refused to fight, like the Quakers, who were pacifists, and they were obviously not going to help in the cause of the war. So, talking about the Loyalists who are in America and still retaining allegiance to Great Britain, by this time there was about a fifth or 20% of the Americans who still considered themselves, even after the Declaration of Independence, still considered themselves very loyal to the king and to Great Britain. Another reason why they retained allegiance was they were still members of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was the Church of England, and since they owed their faith alliance to the Anglican Church, they felt that they were obligated to support the king also. Thirdly, the Loyalists depended on the British for their jobs. They had jobs like tax collectors, custom officers, and even governors in some of the colonies in America. So they knew had they split ties with Great Britain, they too would lose their livelihood. And the fourth reason why many Americans stayed loyal to Great Britain and the king was because they had feared chaos if the rebels had won. At least with the king, they knew what they were going to get. They knew that they would have security and organization and a running government. But if the rebels win, what would take the place of this government that was already in place? A loyalist in a journal had said, "It is better to be ruled by a tyrant 3,000 miles away than to be ruled by a mob at our doorsteps. And in fact, there is some validity to that argument, because who knows what happens if the rebels win. You have this whole process of coming up with a new government and constitution and all of that. So we've kind of gone through all the bads for the Patriots. Now let's move on to the advantages for the Patriots. Number one, they held home field advantage. No one knew their land better than themselves. Number two, they had a reason to fight. They were fighting for their way of life. They were fighting for their homes and their jobs and their livelihood. However, on the flip side, you have the Redcoats, who were basically on foreign soil, and the German Hessians, or the mercenary soldiers who were in America. They were simply fighting for money. And so you could tell, that the Americans are going to be much more determined to fight, because it's more than about money. It's about their lives and their children. Third advantage that the Patriots had was George Washington, still being known as the hero from the French and Indian War at Fort Necessity. Washington brought a certain kind of grit and determination, and he was very well respected. He's one guy who could be put in command, and the men would follow. They would listen to him. There would be no overthrowing of the general or a mutiny against the general. In Chapter 6 in the book, they make special mention of women who fought during the Revolutionary War. I'm sure all of us probably know of an aunt, a sister, or a mother, or someone in your family as a female serving for our country. Well, the same happened even during the American Revolution, though they weren't really supposed to be fighting in the war. But one of the special women that they make interest or make reference to is Margaret Corbin. She actually followed her husband through the war, going from camp to camp, from battle to battle with him. But when her husband is killed in battle, she will actually take up his fight and fight in his position. And another really cool story is the story of Mary McCauley. Her nickname was Molly Pitcher. She got that nickname because she was responsible for fetching pitchers of water for the soldiers to hydrate them. But when a guy who was manning the cannon went down, Mary, the legend has it, Mary drops the water and then pitches in and helps man a cannon in one of the battles. And finally, we have Deborah Simpson, who disguised herself as a teenage boy in order to enlist in the Army. And she actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and then after fought in order to win a pension, in order to get paid by the U.S. government for her service. That's the Battle of Long Island. Battle of Long Island is going to be the first major battle on a very, very huge scale, which involves tens and thousands of troops on both sides here. We have the British here heading over to America with 350 to 400 warships heading straight for New York City. They're going after New York City because they know that it is the financial center of the colonies. So the Americans are going to have to attempt to defend New York City from the most powerful navy in the world. So led by General Howe on the British side, they are going to obviously outnumber the Americans, but they will also outmaneuver or outwit the Americans. The Americans, though, didn't really stand a chance. They did, in fact, stay and they fought. The British tried to come over with a show of force with all these warships, 32,000 troops, and each warship having up to 60 guns on it. So really they were hoping that they would really scare the Americans and then force them to drop their arms and flee. But the Americans stood. They stood, however, they will suffer heavy losses. They were not able to take on the barrage that the British were pounding them with. So the Americans were forced across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. There, the Americans were left to look back at New York City as it was burning. about 25% or a fourth of the city had been burnt in this attack. And this is going to be the worst attack on New York City up until September 11th of 2001, to show you kind of the significance of this attack on New York. So with 32,000 troops and 400 warships, the British are just too much to handle for the Americans. To show you a battle map of what is happening here, in blue are the American positions, and in red are the British positions. The British, with all their warships, were able to surround Long Island, put on a naval blockade, so to speak, and also they were able to put troops on the ground, which then would surround the positions of the Americans here in the Brooklyn and Heights area. So you had twice as many men on the British side as you do the Americans. And on the nights of the 26th and 27th of August, the British troops make their march and onto the Americans, kind of surrounding them. And the Americans cannot take on this attack. They are forced to flee and retreat. And they're going to flee and retreat across the New York Bay and go into New Jersey, eventually all the way into Pennsylvania. So, you know, having been defeated pretty soundly and also not having a lot of war supplies, Great Britain at this point had figured, okay, we're pretty much going to win this quickly, because there's no way the rebels can survive a grueling winter that's going to be coming up here shortly. And they thought that the rebels would simply give up. All right. Along with the women mentioned in the chapter, we also want to discuss some African American heroes of the Revolution. Now, at first, African Americans are banned in the war, and because a lot of the southern states had feared that arming African Americans would only incite a revolt by slaves. But by war's end, with the Americans desperate for more troops, African soldiers are allowed to enlist, and were even guaranteed freedom from the Second Continental Congress if they had fought honestly and dutifully in the American Revolution. Some names I would like to mention of African American heroes of the Revolution that I think a lot of times the history book kind of fails to bring up and really show the significance of their contributions in the Revolution. Number one, you have Peter Salem. Peter Salem fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was actually responsible for assassinating or killing the British Major Pitcairn at Bunker Hill. Pitcairn being one of the leading commanders in that battle, and Peter Salem was the one who took him out. You also have Prince Estabrooks. He is said to be the first to get into the fight at Lexington. So literally, at the first shot of the Revolution, he was the first person there. And I like this guy right here, Oliver Cromwell. Was an interesting place in history. All of you are probably well aware of the painting done of Washington crossing the Delaware. And what a lot of people don't know is Oliver Cromwell, an African American, was actually on that boat sitting right in front of George Washington in that painting. Also, we have James Armistead, who, without him, the war may have gone on longer and longer. Armistead had befriended British General Lord Cornwallis, and Cornwallis was fooled into thinking that Armistead was working for him. But lo and behold, Armistead was taking all this British information and giving it to De Lafayette and George Washington. So he acts as a spy, which helps the Americans block and capture the British at Yorktown, which in effect ends the war. Here are some pictures showing our African American heroes. This first one here is a scene at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here you have Peter Salem killing Pitcairn in this photo right here. And this is the famous painting that I was talking about earlier, the crossing of the Delaware. And I don't know how well you can see it from the video, but if you pull it up online, you will find Oliver Cromwell will be right here on the other side of the boat, right beside George Washington. Not many people know that. Then up here in this picture, you have Marquis de Lafayette, which I'll get to later. And beside him is James Armistead, who worked with Lafayette in spying on the British. So the Americans suffer some heavy losses, definitely at the Battle of Long Island. And they are pushed back from New York. They've lost their city of New York. And now the Americans have to come up with something big. George Washington has to be bold, courageous, and think outside of the box after these losses. And this opportunity comes on Christmas night of 1776. Knowing that the Germans just across the river, the Delaware River near Trenton, are celebrating and drinking and getting drunk at camp because they're celebrating Christmas, he makes a bold move in crossing the cold and icy Delaware and surprise attacking the Hessians. It was such a huge surprise that Washington really did not have to kill many of the Hessians, rather captured hundreds and hundreds of Hessian soldiers and kept them as prisoners of war. So from his victory crossing the Delaware, George Washington is also able to keep the momentum going, and he pushes the British out of Trenton, New Jersey, and then he pushes on to Princeton, New Jersey, and has a victory there. So now you have three big things happening for the Americans. It's kind of like a turning point, so to speak. And things are starting to look better for the Americans. As a matter of fact, the American morale is going to be lifted because they're following their leader, George Washington. He's coming up with these bold and courageous plans. And I found an interesting quote from a British newspaper author who was in the Americans covering the Revolutionary War. He says, a few days earlier, the Americans had given up the cause for lost. Their late successes, though, have turned the scale, and now they are all liberty mad again. So, totally changes the morale here. All right, so let's talk about the British war strategy in 1777. It's going to have three parts to it. Number one, they were going to take the Hudson River, which obviously would be a channel where you can transport goods. They were going to take Albany, New York, the capital of New York, and then move on to crush the Patriots in Philadelphia, and then eventually capture Philadelphia, the capital of the colonies. So the three British officers who were in charge of making this war strategy, which they thought would end the war right here in 1777. You had John Burgoyne, who was going to come from Canada and collapse down onto Albany. You have St. Ledger, who was going to come from Ontario and collapse on Hudson. And then you had General William Howe, who was already in New York City because of the Battle of Long Island. He was going to move from New York City and he's going to go after the capital city of the colonies, Philadelphia. And he's successful in doing so. He does capture Philadelphia, and the Second Continental Congress is made to flee the city. So now the Americans have lost their financial city, they've lost their capital city, and now their Congress is on the run. It looks like everything is going to fall apart at this point. So in the winter, like all wars during this time, you're going to kind of have a stoppage in the war. So in the winter of 77 to 78, there's going to be two different stories here on the war front here. On the British side, they're going to, especially William Howe, they're going to enjoy their winter in style. They're going to be in the warm buildings in Philadelphia. They're going to partake in fine dining and even lavish balls where they would dance and have all this finery. But on the flip side, the Americans, who were not more than 20 miles away at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, they were suffering. This was a low point for the Americans here. They were in makeshift cabins in the frigid, frigid cold Valley Forge. It's a horrible winter struck them in that year. They had little food, so they were poorly fed, poorly clothed. there was journal articles that discussed having seen red footprints in the snow at Valley Forge because many of these soldiers did not have boots to wear. And so things were pretty bad. And at Valley Forge, Washington is going to lose about 25% or a fourth of his army just due to the illnesses at the encampment at Valley Forge. Just really a terrible winter for the Americans. But the British are going to make some mistakes, especially John Burgoyne. He's going to make some mistakes that are going to be very costly and which will turn the tide of the war. John Burgoyne was known as Gentleman Johnny. He liked the best of the best. He was a pretty good-looking dude. He was very popular with the ladies, and he had to have the very best. He traveled with nearly 30 wagons of luxury and fine dinery and all of that. Also, along the way, the Americans are going to slow his advance by cutting down trees and putting it in the paths of Burgoyne's advance. So this is going to slow Burgoyne because it was such a big operation to move, and plus the Americans were putting barricades in their way, and Burgoyne is not going to get very far very quickly. So Burgoyne is going to be met by the Americans at Saratoga, kind of around the area of Fort Ticonderoga in northern New York. And Burgoyne was supposed to get reinforcements from St. Ledger, but thanks to Benedict Arnold, Ledger is held up and is not able to meet Burgoyne at Saratoga. So then the Americans just keep coming, and they're going to surround Burgoyne. And Burgoyne has no other option but to surrender to General Horatio Gates and the superior numbers of the Americans. Now, Saratoga, it is crucial because of this right here. It is the turning point of the war. Saratoga, what does it do for the Americans? Saratoga proves to France and to Spain that the Americans can actually defeat the greatest army on the earth. They could beat the British. And the ambassador to France, Ben Franklin, is over there in France, hears of the news of Saratoga, the big victory for the Americans, and Franklin says to the French, look what we can do. We can do this. With little to nothing at all, we have made a major victory at Saratoga. So France then decides to sign on with the Americans. They give them money, war equipment, and even troops into this revolution. And also, having survived Valley Forge, not Froge, but Forge, the Americans are going to be more disciplined, more unified, and more determined than ever. They had went through the worst of the worst, but here they are alive and even more well-trained thanks to von Steuben. 4 and 8. Here are a couple of gentlemen who helped the Americans at the turning point of the war. First one was Marquis de Lafayette. He was a Frenchman who became a trusted aide to George Washington. And he and George Washington are going to kind of coordinate and cooperate together so that the French could take their commands from de Lafayette and help the Americans. Then you have von Steuben, Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian, who is going to go to Valley Forge and instruct the Americans and drill the Americans into becoming a disciplined army, an actual army, and not just a ragtag army of merchants and farmers. But the Americans, even though the war effort is starting to turn in their favor, on the economic side of things, things are proving to be pretty difficult. First, the Second Continental Congress had no power to tax individual colonies. They could only ask for help from the colonies, but the colonies were the only ones that could tax their own people. So they did not have the power to tax. And in order to pay for the war, they simply just printed more and more money, millions and millions of dollars of money. But they did not have the gold backing. And this is only going to cause inflation because your money is not going to be worth anything. It's going to take more money to buy goods. And this war, because of this inflation, is going to put them into huge war debt, and they even struggle to pay their bills and even to pay the Continental soldiers. Now, this war is going to bring to the forefront this ideal of liberty, and it's going to get women and African Americans questioning this idea of liberty in this land of liberty. Women are going to question their place and their treatment in American society. And one of the ladies who was at the forefront of that push was Abigail Adams. We'll talk about her in class later this week. And African Americans noticed the contradiction of America. They called themselves the land of the free, but yet they enslaved their own. How can that be? How can this be justified? And finally, we're going to talk about the treatment of the Loyalists. The Loyalists were treated pretty poorly during the war. They were looked at as the enemies or the traitors in the American colonies. They were shunned. They fell victim to mob activity and mob violence. Some were even arrested and tried as traitors. And in rare occasions, some Loyalists were even executed by hanging. Okay? So this segment is over the American struggle in the Revolution, but by the middle, especially at Saratoga, things will start to churn. And now when we meet next time, we're going to talk about how the war then moves out into the Western Front in Ohio and Indiana, and then how it moves down into the South, because the British are now getting beat in the Northeast area. We'll see you later in class. Thanks.